Well, folks, here again, it's time for the weekly forecast. A little bit drier conditions this past 7 days compared to the previous 7 days, although we did see some areas that did receive some localized moderate precipitation. Most areas failed to receive more than an inch of moisture this past week, and so we did see a little bit of a drying pattern starting to develop, particularly as we headed into southwestern Nebraska, which has been problematic and is probably the driest, one of the driest areas of the state is basically on the northern end of a very dry pattern that exists all the way down through the western high plains. Now, as we go forward in time, the one thing that we've been looking at recently has been this moderate temperature trend that has been a little bit of a concern, especially with the planting delay issues. It does appear, at least from the models that I'm looking at, that we are going to start to see an abrupt movement toward very warm conditions, particularly as we get into the middle of the month, as a very large dome of high pressure starts to build its way across the southern plains. Would not be surprised that we'll start to see temperatures consistently in the upper 90s to low 100s, basically from central Kansas southward, and some of that may encroach into Nebraska. So let's take a look at the upper air models to see if any of that's in store for us. And the one thing I'll show you today is that we do have a northwest flow aloft. We do have that warm front that's coming through that has been responsible for some of the scattered precipitation. And as that warm air moves into our region, we'll start pushing the heavier precipitation over some of the very soggy areas of Iowa and points to the east. Now, as we go into tomorrow, you can really start to see this ridge building in, so some very warm conditions in the southern plains. We will see some systems moving along the periphery of this ridge, so we can't rule out scattered thunderstorm activity. It'll be fairly isolated in nature. And then as we get into Monday, we'll start to see that ridge start to center itself across the south central United States. Most of the primary activity will be to our north. But again, we can't rule out a scattered thunderstorm as we sit right at the periphery of this ridge, and we do tend to see some of these ridge riders moving along the edge of that ridge. Now, as we go into Tuesday, we start to see that ridge sags a little bit in response to a trough trying to build into the Pacific Northwest, and there'll be some energy moving out of the southwest that may generate some scattered shower and activity across western Nebraska. But as we get into Wednesday, this looks to be where the energy kind of lays across South Dakota and maybe influencing much of northern Nebraska with some widespread shower and thunderstorm activity, lesser as you get toward the Nebraska border with Kansas. Now, as we go into Thursday, we'll start to see that ridge rebuilding, and again, we're right on the periphery of that ridge, so we may see some active weather again, but it'll be more isolated in nature. By the time we get to Friday, the ridge really starts to build into the south central Rockies, and the cold air remains to our north. So in terms of the temperature forecast, my models that I'm using are looking at some very warm temperatures during the early part of the week as that ridge builds in, and then we'll start to see a slight cool down, at least in eastern Nebraska. The best chances for widespread moisture across the state would be in the Tuesday, Wednesday timeframe, but we will have the isolated thunderstorm activity to deal with. Now, in terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast, we start to see the warm air building in across much of the Intermountain region, and as we look at the precipitation, with that ridge building in, we're starting to see the drier weather moving into our region.